In the pre-dawn darkness of August 7, 1942, off the jagged coast of Guadalcanal, the Japanese destroyer Teruzuki cut through the calm, tropical waters with an almost casual confidence. The air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel, heavy with the heat of the approaching day. On deck, the crew adjusted sails and manned stations, lulled into a false sense of security by the quiet night. Then, without warning, a thunderous roar shattered the stillness. A torpedo had found its mark. The ship heaved violently, metal screeching as it twisted under the impact, and flames roared across the water like a molten river. Officers and sailors alike were thrown off balance, and for the first time, the Japanese felt the sting of vulnerability that had been foreign to them in their seemingly invincible Pacific Navy. The attackers were not battleships or bombers, but American patrol torpedo boats, or PT boats, small vessels measuring only 77 feet in length, powered by 3 Packard 4M 2500 engines, capable of pushing speeds over 40 knots. Their low profiles made them almost invisible in the moonless night, and their 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes packed a punch that could topple even the most heavily armored destroyer. The Teruzuki's crew had only moments to react. Flares were fired, guns turned toward the sound of the engines slicing through the water, but the PT boats were already gone, leaving chaos in their wake. Officers on the Teruzuki later recounted the disorientation and disbelief. A ship that had been secure in the waters of the Solomon Islands had been reduced to a sinking wreck by vessels that seemed to appear from nowhere. This sudden vulnerability sent shockwaves through Japanese naval command. Previously, night operations had been considered a domain of calculated maneuver and superior gunnery, where Japanese destroyers could overwhelm Allied forces with speed and precision. The Teruzuki incident, however, exposed a gap in their doctrine. These small, agile boats could strike under cover of darkness with impunity. The loss of experienced sailors and the destruction of essential supplies challenged the assumption that Japanese night superiority was unassailable. Reports from the time describe a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Radar was limited, and the traditional scouting methods failed to detect these tiny, fast-moving threats until it was too late. In the days following August 7th, the Japanese conducted hurried assessments of the PT threat. They discovered that the boat's torpedoes had a range of approximately 3,500 yards and carried warheads weighing over 600 pounds, enough to breach the hulls of larger ships. The machine guns, while secondary to the torpedoes, offered effective suppressive fire during fleeting engagements, and the speed and maneuverability of the PT boats made them exceedingly difficult targets. Japanese naval officers documented the unpredictability of these attacks, noting that even when the PTs were spotted, their evasive capabilities often allowed them to escape unscathed. This was a stark departure from the conventional naval engagements of the Pacific, where destroyers and cruisers dominated through coordinated firepower and tactical formations. The Teruzuki's sinking marked not just a tactical loss, but a psychological one. Japanese commanders began to question whether their mastery of night fighting, previously demonstrated in battles such as Savo Island and the Coral Sea, could withstand this new type of warfare. They scrambled to develop countermeasures, from deploying additional picket boats to adjusting formation strategies. But the PT boat's very nature, small, fast, and elusive, rendered many traditional responses ineffective. Meanwhile, American commanders quickly recognized the potential of these attacks, refining tactics that emphasized stealth, surprise, and precise timing. The stage was set for a new dimension of naval warfare, where audacity and innovation could topple numerical and technological superiority. As the Teruzuki slipped beneath the waves, the flames lighting the early morning sky, it became clear that the Pacific theater had changed irrevocably. What had seemed a minor skirmish was, in fact, the opening act of a series of nighttime engagements that would unsettle the Japanese Navy and elevate the PT boat from a mere auxiliary craft to a symbol of strategic ingenuity. The next chapter would follow the development and deployment of these boats, tracing how they evolved from experimental craft into a weapon that could alter the course of battles across the Solomon Islands and beyond. Before the dawn of the PT boat era, naval warfare was dominated by giants of the sea, battleships and cruisers whose sheer size and firepower dictated the terms of engagement. Daylight battles were the norm, with heavily armed ships exchanging broadsides under meticulously calculated maneuvers. The Japanese Imperial Navy, at the height of its confidence, epitomized this doctrine. Their fleet, composed of vessels like the Fubuki-class destroyers and the Myoko-class heavy cruisers, projected an aura of invincibility. Japanese commanders believed that their mastery of surface combat and night-fighting tactics rendered them untouchable, especially in the darkness of the Pacific night. The very notion that a small, lightly armed craft could threaten such titans of the ocean was not merely unlikely, it was inconceivable. Yet the Allies, observing Japanese dominance in the early stages of the Pacific War, recognized the urgent need for innovation. Conventional tactics and sheer force could not match the skill, numbers, and coordination of the Imperial fleet. The solution came in the form of the Patrol Torpedo Boat, or PT boat, a vessel that would redefine naval combat in ways the Japanese had not anticipated. Measuring just 77 feet in length, with slim wooden hulls and triple Packard engines capable of propelling them at speeds exceeding 40 knots, these boats were designed for one purpose: to strike swiftly and vanish before the enemy could mount a counterattack. Torpedoes formed their primary offensive armament, supplemented by twin 50-caliber machine guns that provided defensive fire and harassment potential. The PT boat's small size and remarkable agility made it ideal for the labyrinthine waters surrounding the Pacific Islands. Coral reefs, narrow straits, and hidden coves, previously obstacles for large warships, became avenues for ambush and rapid assault. Their ability to appear and disappear with the night made them invisible hunters in the eyes of the enemy, and their speed allowed them to execute hit-and-run tactics that undermined Japanese confidence in their supposed night supremacy. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time, Japanese naval officers faced a threat that could not be measured by tonnage or armor, a weapon defined by cunning, timing, and audacity rather than brute force. The development and deployment of PT boats marked more than a technological innovation. It signaled a fundamental shift in Allied naval strategy. Mobility, surprise, and psychological disruption took precedence over firepower alone. The PT boat became an instrument of asymmetric warfare, exploiting the vulnerabilities of a fleet accustomed to dominating through mass and armor. In the months that followed, these small vessels would strike at Japanese convoys, supply lines, and isolated ships, forcing the enemy into a reactive posture. The Imperial Navy, so confident in its control of the seas, now faced an adversary that did not play by conventional rules, a threat that would redefine night combat in the Pacific and set the stage for the audacious raids that would shock commanders across the theater. The PT boats represented a remarkable convergence of speed, firepower, and stealth, tailored specifically for the harsh and unpredictable environment of the Pacific theater. Among the most widely deployed were the Elco 80-foot models, crafted from carefully layered mahogany planks that balanced strength with lightness, allowing the boats to skim across the waves with minimal resistance. Beneath their sleek wooden hulls thrummed the heart of the vessel, 3 Packard 4M 2500 engines, each producing an astonishing 200 horsepower. These engines could propel the boats to speeds of 41 knots, making them some of the fastest naval craft afloat during the war, capable of closing in on a target, striking, and vanishing before the enemy could react. Despite their relatively small size, the PT boats were heavily armed for their dimensions. 4 torpedo tubes offered the means to challenge even heavily armored destroyers, while twin 50-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons provided suppressive fire against smaller vessels or shore defenses. Depth charges added another layer of versatility, allowing PTs to engage submarines or defend against underwater threats. Crucially, the shallow draft of these boats enabled them to navigate coral reefs, shallow coves, and coastal channels, areas where larger Japanese vessels could not venture, turning the very geography of the Pacific Islands into an ally for these nimble, crafted technological innovation further amplified their lethality. Radar sets and improved night vision optics allowed PT crews to detect enemy ships in near-total darkness, turning the night, once the domain of Japanese destroyers, into a battlefield the Allies could dominate. Commanders quickly learned to exploit these advantages, coordinating attacks that leveraged both surprise and speed, striking convoys and retreating with minimal losses. Each engagement, no matter how small in scale, chipped away at the Japanese sense of invincibility at sea. In every aspect of their design, from the mahogany hulls to the triple-engine power plants, from torpedoes to radar, PT boats embodied the ingenuity and adaptability of the Allied naval forces. They were a direct answer to Japanese naval superiority, a weapon forged not to outmatch in size or armor, but to outthink, outmaneuver, and outpace the enemy. By the time these boats began striking in earnest across the Solomons and beyond, the stage was set for a new type of naval warfare, fast, audacious, and impossible for traditional fleets to ignore. The first decisive proving ground for PT boats came in the waters off Guadalcanal in August 1942, a theater already ablaze with the struggle for control of the Solomon Islands. On the night of August 7th, under a sky veiled in dense tropical darkness, a squadron of American PT boats maneuvered silently toward a Japanese convoy. Among the escorting ships was the destroyer Teruzuki, a sleek and powerful vessel part of a larger effort to reinforce Japanese positions on the embattled island. The sea was unusually calm, the scent of salt and diesel thick in the air, masking the approach of the fast-moving Allied craft. Operating under cover of darkness, the PT boats exploited every advantage of their design. Their small profiles rendered them nearly invisible, and the whine of their Packard engines blended with the ambient sounds of the night. As they closed in, the crews prepared their torpedoes, aware that a single well-aimed strike could cripple the enemy. Moments later, the Teruzuki was struck. A tremendous explosion ripped through its hull, flames licking the surrounding water, while sailors scrambled in panic. In a matter of minutes, the once formidable destroyer was listing and sinking, its loss sending shock waves through the Japanese command. Reports from surviving officers conveyed disbelief and confusion. A vessel they had considered virtually untouchable had fallen to craft no larger than a fishing boat. The operation was more than a single tactical victory. It was a revelation. The Teruzuki incident demonstrated the lethal potential of PT boats in night combat, revealing vulnerabilities in Japanese naval doctrine that had previously been considered non-existent. For the first time, Japanese commanders confronted the reality that small, fast, and stealthy vessels could strike devastating blows and vanish before retaliation. The psychological impact was immediate. Convoys and destroyer formations, once assumed safe under the cover of night, now required heightened vigilance and entirely new strategies to counter this elusive threat. In the aftermath, PT boats began to earn a reputation for audacity and effectiveness. Their hallmark became clear: the ability to strike swiftly, inflict damage, and retreat into darkness before the enemy could mount a response. Guadalcanal had become a proving ground, not just for troops and tanks, but for innovation at sea, where speed, surprise, and tactical cunning could rival sheer tonnage and firepower. The Teruzuki sinking signaled the start of a broader campaign in which PT boats would harry Japanese supply lines, disrupt reinforcements, and redefine night engagements across the Pacific theater. Each success forced the Imperial Navy to reassess its assumptions, shaping a new dimension of warfare that emphasized agility and daring over traditional might. The Japanese response to the PT boat threat evolved in stages, moving from disbelief to mounting alarm. At first, intelligence reports dismissed these small, fast craft as trivial nuisances, derisively referring to them as toy boats. Commanders on the decks of heavy cruisers and destroyers could scarcely imagine that such diminutive vessels might threaten ships of their size and firepower. Yet, as reports of successful nighttime attacks accumulated, each strike leaving damaged or sunken vessels in its wake, the reality could no longer be ignored. Survivors' accounts, reconnaissance observations, and the unmistakable loss of ships forced the Japanese High Command to acknowledge that the PT boats were more than minor annoyances. They represented a genuine and disruptive threat. In response, the Japanese implemented a series of countermeasures aimed at neutralizing the elusive craft. Convoys were reinforced with additional destroyers and picket ships, while night patrols were intensified, and radar and lookouts were tasked with detecting the swift intruders. Japanese commanders experimented with changes in formation and tactics, attempting to anticipate the PT's movements and intercept them before they could strike. Yet the Allied boats' advantages, speed exceeding 40 knots, low profiles, and the ability to operate in shallow, reef-strewn waters made them extraordinarily difficult to catch. Repeated attempts to corner or engage the PTs often ended in frustration, with the small craft vanishing into the darkness as if they had never been there. The psychological toll on Japanese sailors was profound. Ships once considered secure under cover of night became vulnerable to sudden, almost invisible attacks. The uncertainty of when or where a PT boat might appear created tension and caution, forcing officers to alter routines and assignments. Each night brought the possibility of surprise, turning routine convoy operations into high-stakes gambles. Over time, this fear and uncertainty catalyzed a shift in Japanese naval strategy, prompting commanders to dedicate more resources to countering these small, agile adversaries. What began as skepticism gradually transformed into a grudging respect and a pervasive anxiety for a threat that had redefined the dynamics of Pacific naval warfare. The remarkable combat performance of PT boats quickly translated into a surge in production and deployment across multiple theaters of war. Recognizing their strategic value, the United States Navy leaned heavily on Elco and Higgins Industries, the two primary manufacturers, to meet the escalating demand. Elco, based in Bayonne, New Jersey, produced 399 of the sleek, 80-foot boats by the end of the war, while Higgins Industries, operating out of New Orleans, contributed another 199. Each vessel was painstakingly crafted, blending speed, agility, and firepower into a compact but lethal package. The goal was clear: ensure that these nimble strike craft could be deployed wherever the Allies faced Japanese or Axis naval dominance. Deployment was far from simple. PT boats required an intricate network of logistical support to remain operational in the vast expanses of the Pacific, as well as in the Mediterranean and Atlantic theaters. Squadrons, typically composed of 12 boats, depended on tenders, larger support ships that provided repairs, fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Bases had to be strategically positioned, often on captured or hastily constructed islands, to maintain a forward presence and allow rapid response to enemy movements. The coordination between manufacturers, naval supply chains, and forward operating units demanded precision. A delay in spare parts or fuel could render an entire squadron ineffective. This complex infrastructure highlighted the Allies' commitment to the PT boat program, recognizing that these small vessels, despite their size, could yield disproportionate results. The careful orchestration of production, maintenance, and deployment ensured that PT squadrons remained a persistent threat to enemy shipping lanes, coastal operations, and supply convoys. Each operational success reinforced the Navy's confidence in these agile craft, proving that with proper support, even relatively diminutive vessels could exert enormous strategic influence. The expanding PT boat program underscored a broader shift in naval warfare. Adaptability, speed, and ingenuity could rival traditional measures of power, setting the stage for increasingly daring nighttime raids across the Pacific and beyond. After the dramatic debut at Guadalcanal, PT boats rapidly became a persistent and unpredictable threat across the Pacific theater. In the Solomon Islands, they conducted relentless raids against Japanese supply lines, slipping through coral-strewn channels and striking merchant ships under the cloak of darkness. Each attack not only sank vessels, but also sowed confusion, delayed reinforcements, and disrupted the flow of essential supplies to Japanese garrisons, undermining the enemy's operational tempo. Crews learned to exploit every advantage of the archipelagic terrain, using narrow straits and hidden inlets to launch ambushes and vanish before retaliation could be mounted. Their role expanded beyond isolated raids. During the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, PT boats contributed to the larger naval engagement by performing reconnaissance, probing enemy formations, and harassing Japanese ships on the flanks. While their torpedoes did not always score decisive hits against heavily armed warships, their presence forced Japanese commanders to allocate ships and resources specifically to counter these small, agile craft. Every diversion weakened the Japanese defensive posture, stretching their fleet and complicating broader operational planning. In the Philippines campaign, PT boats continued to exploit the night as a battlefield advantage. Operating close to shore and in shallow coastal waters, they struck Japanese convoys with remarkable efficiency, sinking transports and escort vessels alike. Each successful operation reinforced the perception of PT boats as a force multiplier, small in size but capable of creating disproportionate strategic effects. For Japanese naval planners, the challenge was constant. Every night brought the risk of surprise, and the need to defend against these unpredictable attackers siphoned attention from other critical objectives. Across the Pacific, PT boats had earned a reputation not only for audacity, but also for their ability to reshape the tactical and psychological landscape of naval warfare, proving that speed, stealth, and daring could rival the might of even the most formidable fleets. The presence of PT boats in the Pacific extended far beyond their tangible destruction of ships. They waged a campaign of psychological warfare that left an indelible mark on Japanese forces. The sheer unpredictability of these swift, low-profile vessels created a pervasive sense of fear among sailors and commanders alike. Nights, once considered a respite from the relentless grind of daytime operations, became periods of heightened tension, with every shadow and distant engine noise sparking anxiety. Japanese officers noted that crews operated under constant stress, their confidence eroded by the knowledge that even a single PT boat could appear from nowhere, strike with deadly precision, and vanish before retaliation could occur. This atmosphere of uncertainty forced tangible changes in Japanese naval operations. Patrols were lengthened, formations tightened, and additional ships were diverted solely to counter the PT threat, stretching resources and complicating broader strategic objectives. Commanders admitted that the psychological toll was as significant as the physical damage inflicted. The constant fear of a surprise attack slowed decision-making, increased caution, and created a pervasive sense of vulnerability across the fleet. Even heavily armed destroyers and cruisers, once symbols of invincibility, were forced into a defensive posture when navigating waters known to harbor these elusive boats. For the Allies, the impact was equally profound, but in the opposite direction. PT boat crews and their supporting forces drew confidence and morale from the knowledge that their daring night raids could unsettle a superior navy. The successes of small, agile vessels against seemingly invulnerable ships became emblematic of a broader Allied ingenuity, reinforcing the belief that strategy, speed, and audacity could compensate for numerical or material disadvantage. In effect, the PT boats reshaped the psychological landscape of the Pacific theater, proving that warfare is as much a contest of nerves and perception as it is of tonnage and firepower. Their legacy was thus measured not only in sunken ships, but in the fear, caution, and recalibration they imposed upon an enemy unprepared for this unconventional threat. The emergence of PT boats carried profound tactical and strategic consequences that reverberated across the Pacific theater. On a tactical level, their presence forced the Japanese to rethink every aspect of naval operations. Convoy routes were altered to minimize exposure to nighttime strikes, escort formations were thickened, and patrol patterns were adjusted to anticipate the sudden appearance of these fast, elusive craft. Each adaptation, however, came at a cost. Ships that might otherwise have been deployed for offensive operations were tied down in defensive measures, constantly alert to threats that could strike and disappear within minutes. Japanese commanders quickly recognized that even small disruptions could cascade, slowing supply deliveries, delaying reinforcements, and creating openings for Allied advances. Strategically, the impact of PT boats was even more significant. By targeting supply lines, troop transports, and isolated vessels, these small craft directly impeded Japan's ability to maintain and reinforce critical positions across the Pacific Islands. Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and later the Philippines all bore witness to the effects of PT boat operations, where logistical disruption weakened enemy garrisons and amplified the effectiveness of larger Allied offensives. Each successful raid contributed to a gradual shift in the balance of power, demonstrating that control of the seas was no longer dictated solely by the size and firepower of surface fleets, but by ingenuity, mobility, and tactical innovation. For the Allies, PT boats represented a remarkably cost-effective tool in the fight against Japanese naval supremacy. Unlike battleships or carriers, which required immense resources, manpower, and time to deploy, PT boats could achieve strategic results disproportionate to their size and expense. They allowed commanders to project force into enemy-held waters, inflict damage, and retreat before retaliation could be mounted. In essence, PT boats transformed the dynamics of naval warfare. Small, agile, and daring, they gave the Allies a way to challenge the Japanese Navy on their own terms, reshaping both tactical calculations and broader strategic outcomes across the Pacific theater.